Hello, and welcome to this short video about the water cycle. Any understanding of watersheds must begin with a working knowledge of the water cycle. The water cycle is something that all of us experience every day. In fact, we all participate in it on a daily basis. But most people never stop to really think about what is happening as water moves from place to place and from phase to phase. But the implications of this movement are very profound, and everything that happens in a watershed is tied to it. We'll start our exploration of the water cycle at the source, a large body of water such as an ocean. For the lower Tennessee River watershed, the source for the vast majority of the water is the Gulf of Mexico, which we see in this image. The next time you hear the TV meteorologist mention Gulf moisture streaming from the south, this is exactly what they're talking about. The water cycle requires something to get the molecules up and moving, and that something is energy from the sun. The process of converting liquid water into gaseous water vapor is called evaporation. As sunlight is absorbed by surface water, the light's energy is transferred to the water molecules. This causes the molecules to move and vibrate faster and faster until they no longer stick to each other and become free individual molecules. The molecules of water are much lighter than the nitrogen and oxygen molecules in the air, so the water molecules begin floating upwards. As anyone who has traveled from valley regions to the mountains knows, the atmosphere gets progressively cooler as altitude increases. As water vapor rises, it gradually cools down and begins vibrating more and more slowly. In the presence of minute particles of dust and smoke, the slowed water molecules begin to stick together again. This process is called condensation, and it represents a phase change from gas to liquid in the form of water droplets or solid in the form of ice crystals. As condensation continues, the droplets or ice crystals become larger and larger until they become a visible cloud. The condensed water gradually becomes heavier and heavier until gravity finally overpowers air resistance and it begins its journey back to Earth. Condensed water falling back to Earth is called precipitation. The most common form is the form of liquid water, which of course we call rain. If a storm is very strong, the raindrops may be carried upward many thousands of feet, where they freeze and begin to fall again. As they fall, more water condenses on the frozen droplets, and they may get carried aloft again where the new moisture freezes. This can happen many times depending on how strong the storm is. Eventually, the ice ball can make its way to the ground as hail. In this picture, we see a heavy downpour with dime-sized hail in it. Occasionally, in the lower Tennessee watershed, the precipitation falls in solid form called snow. Depending on conditions in the atmosphere, liquid water may freeze on the way down to become sleet. So far in the water cycle, we have covered liquid water in the converted liquid water in the Gulf of Mexico to a gas in the atmosphere, evaporation, converted the water back into liquid or solid form, condensation, and brought the condensed water back to Earth as rain, hail, snow, or sleet, precipitation. Now that the water has made it to the ground, which, by the way, is in a watershed, there are a few options. Some can evaporate again, but we won't worry about that. It can soak into the ground, or it can flow across the surface of the ground. The ground in this picture is composed of small sediment particles called soil. Between soil particles are spaces, and water will work its way from the surface into these spaces by a process called infiltration. Infiltration is just a fancy way of saying soaking in. Once the water is in the ground, it will continue to move slowly through the sediments until it comes to a low place. This movement is called percolation, and the water that is filling these spaces between the sediments is referred to as groundwater. The top of this filled or saturated area of sediments is called the water table. Occasionally, the water table appears on the surface. This will be represented by a lake, a pond, a creek, a river, Ever so slowly, the water is heading back towards its source, in the case of the Tennessee River watershed, the Gulf of Mexico. While water is percolating through the soil, it may encounter plant roots. The roots will absorb water, and the water will begin to journey throughout the plant until it reaches the leaves. Lots of interesting things happen to the water along the way, especially in the leaves, but eventually the water leaves the plant in the form of water vapor emerging from the leaves. This movement of water from the soil through a plant and back to the air is called transpiration. So, a quick recap. Water on the ground surface can evaporate, infiltrate into and percolate through the soil, and potentially move through a plant in a process called transpiration. Now, there is another possibility. If the soil is already saturated with water, or if the water lands on an impermeable surface such as cement or concrete or asphalt, the process of infiltration and percolation are not going to operate. Instead, the water will begin to flow across the surface. The accumulation of water on the surface is called collection, and the movement across the surface, always heading downhill, is called runoff. As water continues to accumulate and move downhill, it forms a stream. Streams can merge together, getting larger and larger until they become a river. In the lower Tennessee River watershed, the main river is, of course, the Tennessee River. The water in the Tennessee River flows for hundreds of miles until it merges with the Ohio River at Paducah, Kentucky. Then the water makes its way into the Mississippi River at Cairo, Illinois. The mighty Mississippi down to the Gulf of Mexico, and the completion of the water cycle. Or is it really just the beginning?